Okay, yeah, thank you for the introduction. It's nice to be here, and we arranged to give a kind of a dialogue. So Wolfgang is going to start with the presentation, then I will go on, then Wolfgang again, and me again, and so on, and finally we have the final discussion at the end of the presentation. So I would say let's start, and Wolfgang, perhaps it's your turn.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you, Nariman, for giving us the opportunity to give you a little historic overview of social housing in Vienna in the 20th century. Our talk will start with a brief introduction into the interwar period of Red Vienna and its approach to architecture. Then we will talk about the architect of the Siemensstraße complex, Franz Schuster, and talk about the complex itself, give some notes on the situation in post-war Vienna that led into the construction of this complex, and at the end we'll give a little bit information of people who lived there from the beginning and partially still live there, who were contemporary witnesses in our exhibition that we did there, to give you some information and some insights of how the people were dealing with the spatial situation and with the complex itself, and with Franz Schuster's concept of the new neighborhood that was the main idea of this complex. So the Siemensstraße municipal housing complex is located in the 21st district of Vienna, called Floridsdorf, and it was the result of the so-called rapid building program that was initiated because of a severe housing shortage after the Second World War. But to understand the project, we have to go even more back in time, into the era of so-called Red Vienna, the time between 1919 and 1934, which is globally known, especially for the social housing program. So while other European cities and states managed to elect social democratic leadership only for short periods after the First World War, the Austrian Social Democratic Workers' Party held constant control of the city after gaining absolute majority at the municipal election of May 1919. It is remarkable that this control is not only lasted for 15 years, but also it was achieved by democratic elections and not by any form of revolution or coup d'etat, like it happened at that time with many other socialistic governments and projects in Europe. Because of this, Red Vienna was able to start a leftist project that was aiming towards the creation of a so-called new socialistic human, and therefore to sustainably change the city's culture, the welfare system, the economy, and urban space itself. Here on the map, we see where the 21st district is located in Vienna, so it's north of the Danube. It's the most northern district. And since the 19th century, it always was a very industrialized district with many people of the working class living there and working there. So one of the most significant results of Red Vienna is the city government's municipal housing program. We see a poster here that was the reaction of the miserable housing situation of the working class since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And it was also the reaction to a housing shortage after the war and the following collapse of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. So Vienna, the former imperial capital, the former European metropolis with more than 2 million inhabitants, all of a sudden became the capital of a small republic with around 6.5 million citizens. On top of that, hyperinflation, shortage of supply goods made the situation even worse. And so the city's government started a building offensive that was designed as an answer to these problems. and aimed at the same time towards a better future. We see here the number, 60,000, around 60,000 new homes were built at that time. The goal were 80,000, so it was a huge number. On the next picture that Georg already showed, you see one of the approaches. That were settlements on the periphery with terraced houses, which implemented ideas of cooperative ownership, shared infrastructure, self-administration, and provided the possibility of growing fruit, vegetables, as well as raising small livestock. On the other side, as we saw on the poster before, there were huge residential blocks, huge complexes, actually super blocks like the Karl Marx and the Rabenhof. Here we see an example of the Rabenhof. Here's the Karl Marx Hof. They included a large number of community buildings, such as laundry facilities, kindergartens, schools, public baths, sports facilities, health clinics, libraries, and artist studios. In this way, the needs of practical housing were brought in line with the demands of the new social democratic society by providing a modern and functional living space that adopted proven architectural concepts such as the terrace, the courtyard, the arcade. Another very important goal were well-ventilated and well-lit rooms. In contrast to the housing situation of the working class in times of industrial revolution, running water in all units, as well as club and meeting rooms to promote social activities, which altogether should lead to what Siegfried Giedion had called the humanization of the city. So all of that resulted in the realization of around 60 to 65,000 housing units throughout the era of Red Vienna, and many of them, like the Karl Marx Hof you see here, still shape the city space. One of the architects was Franz Schuster, and Georg will give you now an introduction into the life and ideas of Franz Schuster.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Wolfgang. In addition to what Wolfgang just said, I now would like to focus on the architectural characteristics and specifics of the Siemensstraße Housing Estate. To fully understand the qualities of the Siemensstraße, we at first have to know a bit more about the architect, about his life and his education, about his architectural intentions, about his ideas, and at last, roughly, the context of his thinking. So the architect who planned and erected the Siemensstraße in the 1950s, and this will be, as announced, the focus of our presentation. So the architect of the Siemensstraße was Franz Schuster, and I guess you've never heard of him, and that's not surprising at all. Although Schuster was a highly gifted and a very innovative architect and designer, he was and still is only very rarely mentioned in the dictionaries and in the relevant handbooks. For instance, when we look into the, here in some of these books, for instance, here the front cover of the still canonical Penguin Dictionary of Architecture, or another famous book when we read Siegfried Giedion's Space, Time and Architecture, Schuster isn't mentioned there with a single word. The reason for this lays in Schuster's changing and quite unsteady ideological views. In the 1920s, as a young man, he was a radical left-wing thinker with strong sympathies for Marxism. This can be proved by reading his early writings. In an article from 1926, Schuster, he was still a young man then, proposed to destroy large parts of the old city of Vienna in order to rebuild the town with new architectural forms based on new aesthetic principles. His quite radical intention was to erect a new city for the masses, for the so-called new man or the new human, that is a city for the proletarian who, in Schuster's view, had other and different preferences than the bourgeoisie. And here a quotation from this text. He wrote, the new goals of city planning, of a new culture of living, of a new technical and economic conception of building are so important that in order to prepare the necessary changes, the urban planner, the architect, and the construction manager need support from all sides. This quotation is quite telling and very characteristic for Schuster's idea of what modern architecture and modern city planning is all about. It was his lifelong conviction that architects had the duty not only to build houses or hotels or churches, etc., but to enhance the culture of living, the whole culture of living, as a result of a tight cooperation between the architects, the planners, and the construction managers. So this concept of a cooperation, of a mutual help, of giving support to each other was Schuster's guiding idea throughout his whole life. We will come back to this point later, because this very idea of cooperation, of helping each other, of an efficient neighborhood is reflected in the Siemensstraße housing estate very clearly. So, as said, in his early days, Schuster was quite enthusiastic for the communist and socialist ideology, but then he more and more moved to the political right. And in the 1930s, he worked for the Austrian Fascist Party and finally even for the National Socialists. And I guess this is the reason why Schuster is nearly forgotten nowadays. The historians simply didn't want to get in touch with this problematic person and his architectural legacy. But now, 50 years after his death, the time has come to look at his work in a new light. And that's exactly what we wanted to do when we started to focus on the Siemensstraße, when we started to prepare the little exhibition which was mentioned before. And in doing so, it quickly turned out that despite Schuster's permanent ideological leaps and his permanent reorientations, he obviously was very consequent in going his own way, in pursuing his own goal as an architect. And in this sense, the Siemensstraße estate can and must be seen as the result of all the ideas he had developed in earlier times. One of the most formative chapters in his life was the period when he worked in Hellerau near Dresden in the eastern part of Germany, in Saxony. He lived there from 1919 until 1923. As you probably know, Hellerau is a splendid example for the so-called garden city movement, which was very popular all over Europe, as it was in Italian. Just remember, for instance, the Cusano Milanino, the Città Giardino in the north of Milan, founded by Luigi Buffoli in 1907. So you see this garden movement was an international phenomenon. So the basic idea of the garden city movement was to establish a new concept of urban planning in which self-contained communities were surrounded by green belts. Its aim was to capture the benefits of both the countryside environment and the city environment while avoiding the disadvantages presented by both. Based on the idea of social reform and this ideological background, the social idea is a crucial aspect in the city, in the garden city movement, so that the whole discourse on that was about living in healthy life, living a healthy life under urban circumstances. And that's why these garden cities generally were erected at the periphery of the cities, just as it was in Milan. The Cusano Milanino is located, as you know, about 8 or 10 kilometers in the north of the city center. In other words, the garden city concept combines the town and the country in order to provide an alternative to working or living on a farm or in crowded, unhealthy cities. And that's exactly what we can observe in Hellerau. Walking through the streets, the whole city undeniably had a rural character, as if you live in a village. There are streets with curved rows of houses, and in front of each house there is a little garden where the people living there, the residents, could sit in the sun or plant their own fruits and vegetables. But, and that's an important aspect of this concept, in the vicinity, so very close to these houses, a monumental theatre had been erected, this one, named the Bildungsanstalt, or a center for learning and education, which at the same time was used as a venue for music and dance performances. So as a result, in Hellerau, we have a fascinating combination of nature and culture, of rural and urban life, planned by some of the leading and most prominent architects in Central Europe, namely Hermann Muthesius, Richard Riemer-Schmidt, or Heinrich Tessenow. Franz Schuster lived there for 4 years and worked as an assistant of Heinrich Tessenow. And what Schuster experienced in Dresden finally turned out to be the guiding principle for him as an architect, his combination of nature and culture, and Schuster's intention to enable the lower income groups to live a modern, healthy life was exactly what he wanted to achieve with his work. After 4 years, Schuster left Dresden and came back to Vienna in 1923. He was assigned to erect the so-called Wasserturm estate in the very south of Vienna. Yeah. And the character of this estate is quite similar to what Schuster had seen in Hellerau. Again, we can find a strong emphasis on the nature in general, on the green space all around, and again, the houses are not very high. It is a 2-story housing estate with optimized room layouts and simply decorated facades. In 1927, Schuster was invited to go back to Germany and to join the staff of Ernst May, who was the mastermind of the so-called Neues Frankfurt, or New Frankfurt. Here I show you the cover of the first number of this famous journal, in which all the activities of May and his team used to be presented. For Schuster, this indeed was a decisive step in his career, because now he worked in one of the centers of European modernity. The New Frankfurt stood for the most progressive and most powerful ideas of urban planning. Ernst May, the chief architect in Frankfurt, reflected on contemporary housing in a very innovative way, and he did that on a global scale. May not only worked in Germany, but also in Poland, in Russia, and in East and South Africa. And that's indeed an interesting aspect of the New Frankfurt movement. The architects there throughout had an international scope and observed very closely and very distinctively what happened, for instance, in Italy in the 20s and early 30s. To give an example, in 1931, they published an article on the Movimento Italiano per l'Architettura Razionale, and complained about the fact that in Italy, the ideas of the new housing was not supported by Benito Mussolini. So you see, this discourse on new housing always had a clear political implication. Franz Schuster learned a lot in Frankfurt, especially about the importance of green space planning. I'll show you 2 settlements in which he was involved, and a colored photograph from that time. And even more important, Schuster was confronted with a long-lasting political discussion on the size of the unit. Since in 1928 in Frankfurt there were nearly 20,000 people looking for an apartment, the politicians and the architects realized the urgency to build as fast as possible. Following May, it was better to have a small flat than to have no flat at all. Das Problem lautet heute nicht kleine oder große Wohnung, sondern keine Wohnung oder kleine Wohnung. So the problem today is not a small apartment or a big apartment, but no apartment, or at least a small apartment. I'm just mentioning this because 20 years later, after World War II, we can find exactly the same discussion going on, but this time in Vienna. And the man who stood in the center of these discussions was Franz Schuster, who could rely on the experience he had made in interwar Frankfurt. Then the other important aspect of Schuster's activities in Germany is about his growing interest in questions of furnishing. As a professor at the Frankfurt School of Applied Arts, the so-called Städelschule, he started to focus on the appropriate design for kitchens and living rooms in small and tiny flats. This, of course, was an interesting subject. It was really a challenge because the smaller your flat is, that is, the less room you have, the more you are forced to economically organize your life. Wohnen, lernen, learning to live was one of the key words in those days, not only in Frankfurt, but in Vienna as well. Schuster published various books on that subject. Yeah, two of them. And this again was relevant for his further intellectual development because later on in the 1950s at the Siemensstraße Housing Estate, he faced this problem of furnishing in small flats again. During the dark years of Austrofascism and National Socialism, we find Schuster being back in Vienna. As a professor at the Vienna School for Applied Arts, he educated more than 100 young architects, mainly women, interestingly. That's what I want to emphasize, especially today on the International Women's Day. And then finally, after the end of World War II, when large parts of Vienna were destroyed, you know, this photograph, when Vienna was destroyed and had to be rebuilt, Schuster immediately was engaged to help because the situation was absolutely dramatic. And looking at these photographs, we are reminded about what is going on right now today in the Ukraine. So, Wolfgang, it's your turn now. Here another photograph from Vienna after 1945.
So this is the situation of Vienna after the Second World War. And here you can already see, I mentioned before that in the Red Vienna era in the 20s and 30s, around 60,000 flats were built. But after the Second World War, 86 homes were destroyed or deemed uninhabitable. This meant that more than 12% of homes could not be used, which left around 270,000 people homeless or being forced to live in ruins. Floridsdorf, the district, the 21st district where the Siemensstraße complex is located, had many industrial facilities with a tradition going back to the 19th century, and therefore was particularly affected by the war, especially by aircraft attacks. So around of the 10,000 houses of the 21st district, more than 3,000 were destroyed or heavily damaged. On top of that, of course, right after the war, the inhabitants of Vienna could only survive through international help, mainly provided by the Allied forces of the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the USA, and France, as well as other European countries, mainly Switzerland and Sweden. The city administration was, after the collapse of the Third Reich, again social democratic, and established a building program that in this chaotic situation only slowly gained momentum. And that was the reason why another program, the so-called rapid building program, was launched by the end of the 1940s. This resulted in 4,000 newly built homes by 1954. One of the people responsible for this program, one of the initiators, was at that time city councilor Franz Schuster, who later became the city's mayor and in 1965 president of Austria. As Georg already mentioned, Franz Schuster was in Vienna at that time, but because of his involvement into Austrofascism and National Socialism, he was forced to stay behind the scenes, even though he was one of the driving forces behind the rapid building program. Nevertheless, Schuster stayed behind the scenes, but he became the leading architect during the period of the reconstruction of Vienna in the 40s and 50s. And in 1950, the beginning of his main project, the Siemensstraße Housing Estate, with more than 1,700 accommodation units, started. This project ranks among the pioneering achievements of the era of reconstruction and attracted international attention when it was presented as an example of high quality and affordable housing at an exhibition in New Delhi, for example. So Schuster's concept of the Siemensstraße was deeply rooted into the ideas of Red Vienna's architecture, including all of these community buildings and sites. But he had a new concept now, and that was called the New Neighborhood. That followed English and Swedish concepts of urban development and meant a new form of metropolitan coexistence. The utopian and ideological idea of Red Vienna's architecture that was gearing towards this socialistic new human was not relevant anymore. And on top of it, the National Socialists' concept of a racial collective that had directly led into a global war, genocide, and Holocaust had poisoned any forms of community in the German-speaking world. So the idea of a new neighborhood had to step into the breach, considering the needs of different groups in a post-war society. Single persons, family with children, elderly, many of them heavily traumatized. In other words, Schuster's concept, although building on the visions of the time before the war, had to be much more pragmatic. Since the contemporary society was overaged, many soldiers were still prisoners of war, and there was a huge number of orphans, widows, and invalids. So the new neighborhood also had to organize the coexistence of this society that was full of victims and offenders of National Socialism, and at the same time had to reshape the spaces of post-war Red Vienna. Not Red Vienna, Vienna, sorry. So the Siemensstraße estate was integrated into the still existing established architecture, opening up green spaces and brownfield land and creating a connection to the surrounding industrial areas, where reconstruction already had been started, mainly under the guidance of the Soviet Union, because the 21st district was part of the Soviet Union part of Vienna. Vienna had 4 sectors like Berlin, with all the Allied forces within, and 21st district was a Soviet Union district. On the other side, there was the next phase on the rise, and that was the so-called miracle on the Rhine, or economic miracle, the period of rapid reconstruction and economic development triggered by the USA's Marshall Plan. So this was the situation at the time when the Siemensstraße complex was built, and Georg will give you now some insights of the structure of the complex.
Yes, as Wolfgang just said, the Siemensstraße estate was integrated into the existing architecture. You can see that by taking here the bird's eyes view. In the foreground of this photograph, we see the older houses from the late 19th century. And on the left side, there are houses from the early 1920s. So it gets clear that Schuster obviously wanted to expand the existing urban structure. In other words, it was not his intention to simply put the new estate into the green belt of Floridsdorf, but rather to bring the different styles from different times together, to infuse them in order to create an organic architectural unit. This was one of the key words in those days in the late 50s, late 40s and early 50s, this organic growth, this organische Wachstum. The Siemensstraße estate is of enormous size. The distance from the west to the east, from one side to the other, is 1 kilometer. And when you take a closer look at the photograph, we see that the estate is at least partly surrounded by fields and meadows and trees. I think I have another one. Yeah, here you can see this in a better way. To give some technical details, when we look at the plan of the estate, the total area is 174,000 square meters, but the built area is only 36,000 square meters, so about 21%. All the rest is free space, nature, is gardens, greens, trees, bushes, lawns, and so on. And therefore, it's really amazing when you walk through the estate, when you walk through the area, you do not have the impression to be in Vienna. You do not have the impression to be in the city, but rather to walk through a small village somewhere in the countryside. Maybe you will have the chance when you're in Vienna to visit this estate, then you can experience this certain urban nature feeling. So back to the plan. Looking again on the map of the area, we see the intended infrastructure of the estate. Schuster did not erect a theater, however, as it was the case in Hellerau, but he planned and erected the so-called Volksheim, the communication center, where the residents could organize parties and festivals, where music bands used to perform, where films were shown, and so on and so forth. So the political idea behind that was to offer the people the opportunity to have a social life, a cultural life, and of course a meeting point for the youth, for the local youth. In a book from 1954, we find the following passages about the Siemensstraße. They emphasize the fact that it's not about only tenement houses. It's not only tenement houses are being erected in Vienna within the compass of the social city building program. Also, all those social institutions are not forgotten, which a modern city requires in order to bring forth a healthy, organically harmonious, and emotionally balanced new generation. Schools, kindergartens, baths, playgrounds, and so on, etc., etc. You see the mentioned communication center, this Volksheim, was not the only infrastructural feature in the Siemensstraße. Another is, again, as mentioned, the kindergarten. The kindergarten is right here. Do you see my cursor? Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, the kindergarten area is here, and being located in the midst of the estate, which underlines the importance of the younger generation in the sense of the child as a symbol for a better future. And it's very characteristic for Schuster's idea that he used big windows. So here a contemporary photograph how the situation is right now in the kindergarten, and here an older photograph from the days when Franz Schuster, you see him on the left side, was erecting the kindergarten. And it's interesting to see the big windows in order to make the rooms sunny and bright and healthy. And finally, in the eastern parts of the estate, Schuster planned the so-called residential home for the elderly, the Heimstätte für alte Menschen, where the older generation, the grandfathers and grandmothers, could live their own life. But apart from these social aspects, at the end of my part of the presentation, I would like to point out one rather technical aspect of the Siemensstraße estate. Schuster's most important and most relevant and most interesting innovation was the so-called Duplex-System. I do not know whether you have already heard about it. It was the idea to construct the flats in a certain way that allows two of the small flats to be unified in one bigger flat. And again, I would like to quote from the catalog I was mentioning. So the idea underlying this system is that a large flat is temporarily divided into two small flats, which are let to two independent tenants. After the worst housing shortage has been alleviated, each pair of flats can be united into one bigger flat at very small costs. So this sounds a bit complicated, but in fact it's quite easy. What you see here on the left side are two small flats. Yeah, this is one flat, and here is the second one. So you enter the flat here, and the other front you enter through this door. And the basic idea of unifying these flats is that you break down this wall. You see this here. You brick up this entrance so that there is, as a result, only one entrance, and then you can get in. And as a result, you have not two single flats, but one big flat. So not only two smaller flats with each 32 or 36 square meters, but about 70 square meters. Yeah, this is one of the quite innovative ideas Schuster had. And for the rest of our presentation, I would like to handle over to Wolfgang again, and is going to tell you about the way of living there.
Yeah. So because of the 70th anniversary of building the Siemensstraßen complex, an exhibition was planned, and Georg and I were part of the curatorial team of this exhibition. And the interesting thing about that was that it was a cooperation between the city of Vienna's museum and a social institution, which is called Wohnpartner Team 21, which is focusing on social and cultural work in Vienna's municipal buildings. And they provided space for a group of contemporary witnesses, and you can see most of them here on the picture. They all moved in as children in the 50s or even were born there. Many of them still live there. and their memories and the sources, the pictures and movies they had became an important and integral part of this exhibition. We had the possibility to do numerous focused interviews with these contemporary witnesses, which was resulting also in a book where the memories are displayed. And it also gave us a very intense insight into the situation of the Siemensstraße in the 50s and 60s. So I want to give you a quick summary of the memories and reflections of these people. So growing up in the Siemensstraße meant to have to learn to deal with constricted rooms. Georg mentioned the duplex system. We see here a plan of one of the witnesses that he has done out of memory. This is one of the few apartments that are not in the duplex system, but in shape quite similar. And what you can see here is that you had only one room for living and sleeping. That's the one on the bottom. You had the kitchen on the right, and then this where Georg is pointing now, this is the area for water and a little toilet. In this apartment, a family lived at the beginning. It was mother, father, and one daughter. When the daughter married, her husband moved in too, so they were 4. And after 1 year, they got the first child. So in the mid 1960s, 3 generations lived in this apartment, which had around 30 square meters. Georg was already mentioned that Franz Schuster did interior design too, and had already before the war thought about restricted room and use of furniture. And after the war, he offered a collection of furniture that was aiming for good quality, modernity, and affordability, and also to deal with restricted space. But it turned out that his collection, which nowadays became iconic for 1950s interior design, was still too expensive and, most importantly, not functional enough for these families. So they had to find alternatives. And you can see on the next picture an example, which is a folding table. This folding table is a central part of the exhibition, and you can see here people using this table as for board games, but it was also used by the young girl that you can see here for studying when she had to do homework for school, as you can see on the next picture. And it became also her a place to play with dolls and stuff like that. So all of these furniture parts became multifunctional. You had the same with beds and couches. So the couch turned in the night into the bed of the parents. There was another bed for the daughter that was folded up during the day so that there was more space. So all of these furniture parts became multifunctional and were used in different ways, and it was much work for these people and fixed part of the day to put everything on the side in the morning and to get everything for sleeping back in the evening. We can go to the next picture, which shows actually a bath for dolls of the girl we saw before, and this shows her dream world. That's how she remembers it. So her dolls had a bathroom a bathtub, which she did not have, because all of these apartments just had cold water at the beginning and a toilet, but there were no shower or bathtub or anything like that. This resulted again into creative approaches of the residents. So folding shower trays were installed in the kitchen, close to the water connection. Small mobile bathtubs for children had to be placed on top of the toilets for an uncomplicated water drain. And many people started to install what is it called, convectors for heating and for warm water on their own. Because of these restricted rooms, I think there's another picture where you can see the kitchen, and there you can see that the kitchen stuff was gas ovens, was quite simple too. And at the beginning, people really had to heat the water for washing and for laundry and stuff on these gas ovens. I have to say there were laundries in the complex for the people, and they were heavily used, of course, because of that. This constricted room situation forced the kids to get outside. So during summertime, the kids played in the yards, which you can see on the next picture. They used, even on the bottom, you can see in German, it's called Klopfstange. It's where you can put the carpets on and then you hit it against them to get the dust out. And they were using that for playing, for sports and stuff like that. But there were other elements in this complex that Schuster already had integrated and planned. For example, a pool for the kids, which we can see here. This pool was very attractive for the children, and it was used till the mid-1960s. After that, the laws about hygiene, water hygiene, had changed in Vienna. So that was the main reason why this pool was closed and nowadays is a normal playground. But for the kids between 1950 and around 1965, this was a central room, a central space, and was where they came together and where they had, they had much fun there. And in the memories, it's a very positive space. Another place like that was an ice rink that was right beside the complex. So in winter, the kids and young people met there. You could see on the pictures that Georg showed at the beginning of the complex that around the area at that time there was still brown fields and trees, and the kids used this area too, where they could play, where they could do their own ice rinks, or in summer do their own soccer fields. And this all resulted into a very, very positive memories of childhood. Although it was always overshadowed by this idea of the restricted space when they came home. But even that, most of them turned into positive memory, because it brought the people together and created something like a huge solidarity and functional families that were used to look at each other and to take care for each other. The public education venue at that time showed movies and provided for many of these kids first cinematic experience of international films, mostly from Hollywood and Walt Disney films. Another aspect that most of these young people took part in the activities of the Social Democrat youth organizations, like the Red Falcons, which is a Boy Scout version of the party, or the Friends of Nature. So they always, on the weekends, they went out in the surrounding area into nature and did hiking, climbing, all of that stuff. What you can see on this picture is you can see this horse carriage, and many of these people memorized till the late 60s that farmers that were located around the area came to the complex and sold their goods directly. And here you can see a farmer, and you can see on the carriage, you can see he has potatoes or whatever there, and they came and sold them on the streets, which together with the groceries and small handicraft businesses that Schuster had planned in the complex too, provided a very good supply of everyday goods and also personal contacts. And they were, of course, easily accessible by foot. The other thing is that the complex was located within the broader industrial range of the 21st district, which meant that when these kids grew up, they all found work in the area and had very short ways to work, where they could walk or drive by bicycle. So this altogether brought the impression for us that when these witnesses were reflecting their childhood, they came to the conclusion that the spatial restrictions they had to deal with were demanding, but the answers they had to find to this problem resulted in general in a happy childhood, good experience of community, long-lasting friendships, and many of them stayed in the Siemensstraße after they got married themselves and lived there with their own families. So, and this is the end of our talk. It seems that Franz Schuster's concept of the new neighborhood turned out to be most effective outside of the units. Thank you.
Maybe what we could add, I mean, one of the interesting aspects is that right now people, scholars, art historians, architect historians, these people now start to reflect on these early solutions for tiny houses. In the meantime, we can observe this broad discourse on the necessity to build tiny houses, tiny flats, tiny tenants, and at this moment, some politicians in Vienna started to remember that in the 1950s we had the same discussion. How is it possible to create tiny flats with a high quality of living? This was one of the main discourse and main red lines in the political and architectural discourses from the 1920s onwards until now. And this example of the Siemensstraße is one of the splendid solutions for that urgent questions. Yes, some of the people we were talking to, and some of the people, this was the motivation why we made this little book, was to know more about not only the living in the youth in the 50s and 60s, but also about the question whether they still live there. And it's interesting. That's exactly what Wolfgang has mentioned before. It's interesting to see that all of them have very positive memories, and they have still they appreciate the qualities of this estate. They know quite well that there is a restricted space. Of course, it's not easy to live on 36 square meters, but it is possible, and that's why the remembrance is so positive.
And we also talk to people living there today. Many of them still appreciate the fact that there is so much green space between the different buildings. In the meantime, there's one thing we didn't mention. The duplex system was actually the merging of the apartments happened much later, and still most of the apartments are not duplexed, but this process started in the 1980s, and mainly when the complex was refurbished in 2004. But people there still deal with this restriction, and the other ones who have already the bigger apartments are in the meantime second or third generation, the kids or the grandkids of the people who moved in. And many of these people also appreciate the structure of the complex. On the other side, you have, of course, like in social housing, always you have different kind of people living there. And in the meantime, there is a little bit like you get the idea that some of the older people think, yeah, all these new people, migrants and poor people, they are not good for the area. But in general, it seems that there is what I would call, there is social peace. People complain a little bit about that, but it seems that there are not really substantial problems in the complex. So it still works as the idea of the new neighborhood still works today.
Wolfgang, a question. Did you also speak with the young families? Because I think 32 square meter nowadays is very small flat for a young family with children.
Yes.
How is your experience? Did you have contact with the new families also?
Yeah, we had a little bit of contact during the exhibition with families who, like, grandkids of the first residents, and they live in duplex now, and they say that's totally okay. There are many smaller units that are now inhabited by families with migrant background, and it seems that there is, which is for a historian very interesting, there is a different approach for them. Like, it's the approach of the people who moved in the 50s is for many I talked to a family from Pakistan and to a woman from Somalia, and for them the small space is not a big problem. So they deal with it in the same way the former inhabitants deal with it in the 50s.
But another question, because as you mentioned, just 21% of whole area is building, about 80% is green area, but the people don't have a private open spaces. There is no balcony, there is no, just from the small houses, I think they have their own garden, but the most of the people, they have not private green or balcony. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. They do not have any private space, but the basic idea Schuster had was that at least some of them would have the opportunity to have their own little garden in order to plant their fruits and vegetables and so on and so forth. But this, in fact, was not realized in the end because there was a long-lasting discourse on recuperation, on the idea that the people who are working from Monday to Saturday, because most people had to work on Saturday as well, they need the Sunday for walking through the area, and therefore it was the political idea to open the space, but not to give some parts do the inhabitants as gardens. So what I want to say is there was this discussion, but in the end, it was not realized. So it is an open space. There are, as said, there are kindergartens and playgrounds and so on, but not for each inhabitant a little garden, as it was the case in the at least partly in the 20s, in the 1920s and early 30s.
Okay.
And nowadays you also find a little bit already, and this is enforced by the social workers who work there, like modern ideas and trends like urban gardening. When you walk through the area, you see that at some houses there are like things like that starting to go on, but also communal. So people do that together.
It was not, to make this clear, it was not an intention to glorify this this political idea, to glorify the Siemensstraße estate. It's because, Nariman, you're absolutely right. Living with this family, living on 36 square meters is really hard. That's not easy. But nevertheless, to put it in a historical view, we always have to remember the situation after World War II, when the city was destroyed. The people really were glad to have these flats, to have these units, and insofar it's not possible to it's not possible to compare the situation in the 50s and the late 40s to the situation we have today. But nevertheless, the idea of the architects in those days was to offer the people a high quality and the new living standards. And I think this was, at least for me, this was one of my preferred motivation to deal with that idea.
Yeah. I think you are right. In the 50s, the quality was good, but now we are in the 21st century. And of course, the settlement of course, some qualities. I think this big green area, they also small hub for the people, because from the state you have maybe 4 apartments or 6 apartments. It is a very small neighborhood. That is also a quality in comparing the big settlements or building. But I think that is the work for the students to find the ways to keep this quality and also update all this settlement with the new idea, because you have also the problem with so many cars inside. There is no garage area, and I think the students have time the next 2-3 months to work on that.
It's really clear, and it's interesting how we can interpret that kind of starting condition in heritage, transform that in something new with a strategy of hybridization space with new facilities. I think it can be really an interesting issue, the idea to introduce facilities and to use that open space, that 80% of empty space. It can be really an important solution, important space to use for the students.
Absolutely. Simone, you're absolutely right, and I think I really hope that you will get the opportunity to come to Vienna, because then we can walk through the Siemensstraße estate, and then we can discuss all these problems, so to speak, live and in person, because it's really fascinating. As I was mentioning, it's really fascinating to walk through and to see this infusions and the idea that the constructed space and the open space are infusing somehow. Yeah, that's really interesting, and this offers a kind of quality of living.